Hello, I'm Janine Gilliott, Director of Capital Markets Policy and Outreach at SASB. Welcome to our webinar on the evolution of ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance Disclosure, and the use of ESG disclosure by institutional investors. I want to thank Workiva for co-sponsoring this webinar with SASB. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First off, we will email a recording of this webinar to all participants. Please submit questions. We're going to have about a 20-minute question and answer period at the end of the webinar, and we'd like you to please submit questions throughout the webinar through the question module that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And then I know that many of you are joining this webinar for CPE credit. In order to get your CPE credit, you need to remain logged in throughout the entire webinar. You will need to be logged in with your own contact information. You'll have to answer 4 polling questions, which will occur throughout the webinar, and then there is a survey at the end of the webinar. So please do take that survey and answer our polling questions throughout the webinar so you can get CPE credit. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. As I mentioned, I'm Director of Capital Markets Policy and Outreach at SASB. With us is Bob Hertz, who's a former chair of FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. Bob is also a board member of SASB, Workiva, Fannie Mae, and Morgan Stanley. We also have Rocky Kumar, who's the head of ESG investments and asset stewardship at State Street Global Advisors, and Mac Ryerson, who's the Director of Responsible Investment at Columbia Threadneedle Investments. So I think we have a terrific panel today. I want to talk about our learning objectives. Our objectives today are to obtain a broader understanding of why investors care about ESG information and how investors use the information. We also want you to learn about the current regulatory environment as it relates to corporate reporting on sustainability issues, and to understand the landscape and state of disclosure for climate-related risks. We're going to start with about 8 minutes from me, where I'm going to give you an overview of SASB and the SASB perspective on ESG disclosure. Bob is then going to share his views on the corporate reporting and regulatory landscape. And then Rocky and Mac will share the investor perspective before we open it up for questions. So before we get started, let's do polling question number 1. We just want to understand a bit more about who is on the line, and so we're asking, what is your current role? Are you a corporate sustainability reporting professional? Are you a corporate financial reporting or accounting professional? Do you work in investor relations? Or do you work at an investment firm? Are you an investor, an analyst, or a corporate governance team member at an investment management firm? So we're going to give it a couple of minutes, or a couple of seconds, not minutes, and then let's close this poll. So let's go ahead and close the poll, Jill. So 82% of you have voted, 85% of you have voted. Thanks for that. And we have primarily corporate representatives on the phone, either corporate sustainability reporting or corporate financial reporting. Professionals on the phone. So really hope that all of you find this conversation useful. So let's talk about SASB, and let me get started by talking about SASB's perspective on ESG disclosure. SASB's mission is to establish a market standard for the disclosure of ESG information to investors. The population of investors who care about ESG issues is large and rapidly growing. Rocky and Mac are going to talk about this in more detail later, but increasingly investors see ESG issues as drivers of long-term risk or drivers of long-term return, or both. SASB standards from many other disclosure frameworks. SASB standards are focused on disclosure to investors. SASB is focused on identifying sustainability disclosure topics and metrics that are material, and by material we mean likely to impact financial performance, that are decision useful to investors, that are cost effective for companies to provide, and that are industry specific. And the reason that SASB standards are industry specific is because the ESG factors that are most likely to impact financial performance vary across industries. SASB standards are also developed using an inclusive evidence-based process. They're developed using a process that includes participation by market participants, both issuers and investors. SASB standards development process starts with a broad universe of sustainability issues that could impact risk or return across industries. The starting universe of sustainability issues is grouped into 5 major themes: the environment, social capital, human capital, business model and innovation, and leadership and governance. And sometimes people will look at this list and they'll say, those aren't sustainability issues, those are business issues. That's exactly the point. SASB standards identify sustainability issues that are likely to impact business performance across 79 industries. SASB develops its standards using a rigorous process for each industry. For each of 79 industries, there are 79 industries for which we develop standards. We conduct industry research to identify which topics are likely to be material. We formed industry working groups to obtain feedback from issuers and investors on which topics were likely to be material. And we published an exposure draft for public comment. This process resulted in provisional standards for 79 industries. And right now, we're consulting with issuers and investors one more time to attain additional feedback before codifying those standards this fall, at which time they'll be ready for use by issuers. I mentioned earlier that SASB has issued provisional standards for 79 industries. I wanted to show you what each standard contains. Each standard contains industry-specific disclosure topics. It contains accounting metrics to measure performance for each disclosure topic. It includes a technical protocol for compiling data, which is guidance on how to compile the metrics. And it includes suggested activity metrics to report so that investors can normalize the data. And SASB standards include metrics because we're really focused on comparability of data. The end goal is for investors to be able to compare performance on material sustainability metrics across companies. I wanted to show you a little bit of the output of SASB standards development process. This slide shows you SASB's Materiality Map. This is a quick visual snapshot of which issues are likely to be material across which sectors and industries. This tool, which in this slide is at the sector level, is available at the industry level on our website, along with a field guide, which includes the standards and the metrics for each industry. We're often asked how SASB's efforts relate to sustainability reports. Sustainability reports are important communication tools, but they're focused on communicating a broad range of topics to all stakeholders, including some investors. Those stakeholders could include customers, employees, policymakers. SASB standards are focused on communicating only to investors. We are focused on identifying the subset of sustainability information that is likely to impact financial performance and therefore is of interest to all investors and we believe should be included in mandatory financial filings that are targeted at investors. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk in more detail about the current corporate reporting and regulatory landscape. But first, we have another polling question, which is how would you characterize your sustainability disclosures? And for those of you who are investors on the line, answer this question through the perspective of your own organization that you work for. So would you characterize your sustainability disclosures as you only issue a standalone sustainability report, that you issue a sustainability report and you include some sustainability information in your 10K or 20F filed with the SEC, or do you currently issue a sustainability report and you may include sustainability information in a future 10K or 20F? So we'd love to see your answers to these questions. And what we're seeing so far, about 70% of the attendees have voted, and the majority right now only issue a sustainability report. So I hope you learn more on this webinar about how we're thinking about sustainability disclosure in the 10K and 20F. Just close the poll, and she's sharing the poll results. Thanks. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bob, who has a wealth of experience in his perspective on how the corporate reporting landscape is evolving. Bob?
Okay, thanks. Many thanks, Janine, and hi, everybody from very cold and snowy New Jersey today. Let's just talk about first, you know, why investors find it difficult to use the existing sustainability information in their work. A pretty recent poll study from PwC looked at the degree to which investors thought that they got the information they needed on ESG issues versus the views of issuers on that same issue. And you can see that while 100% of the issuers surveyed thought that they were giving quality information, only 29% of the investors in the survey thought that. And you know, I think one of the reasons, and reflected in the poll we just took, is that many companies, you know, they do sustainability reports, quite proud of them, but that's not the material information on a comparable, standardized basis that investors are looking for. And if we drill down a little further, you can see that there's investors' dissatisfaction around the current state of ESG disclosure for a number of reasons, how risks and opportunities are identified and quantified, the comparability, the relevance, whether there are KPIs shown, and the like. Next, please. Another aspect of the current landscape is that companies are bombarded with questionnaires from investors and other interested parties on ESG and sustainability issues. And I think investor frustration with the availability and the quality of the disclosures that are being made is evidenced by the extent to which they are sending these questionnaires to companies. In fact, companies are annually subject to ESG evaluations by no less than 150 rating systems on approximately 10,000 performance metrics, leading to what we call questionnaire fatigue. As shown on the page there, one large company, General Electric, reported in 2014 that it answered over 650 of those questionnaires, and it took 75 people and several months to do that, with very little value, at least from GE's perspective. Next, please. So, you know, what SASB is all about, the view, the vision is that in the 10Ks, so the future, the 20Fs for foreign registrants, you would have more standardized disclosures using the SASB standards, just in the way that we have standardized financial information under the FASB standards that's included in the 10Ks. Next, please. I think it's important, I think Janine emphasized this, that in developing the SASB standards, sorry, I still revert back to FASB sometimes, the SASB standards, it's guided by the definition of materiality that the U.S. Supreme Court has defined, and you can read the definition there, but I think that's a very important notion. Furthermore, in addition to the Supreme Court definition, over time, the SEC has promulgated various rules and regulations and other guidance. And in fact, Regulation K and other SEC disclosure regulations, which set forth the specific requirements associated with Forms 10K and other SEC filings, while they contain principle-based requirements, they call for both disclosure of current information but also forward-looking information. And the SEC in its 2010 guidance regarding disclosure related to climate change, it noted that certain sustainability information should be disclosed under the existing SEC rules. And in order to do that, that requires careful analysis both of current information but also disclosure of forward-looking information, or how tomorrow is reasonably likely to turn out in respect of material matters based upon what is known today. In particular, item 303 of Regulation SK requires that companies describe known trends, events, and uncertainties that are reasonably likely to have material impacts on their financial condition or operating performance, and to do so in management's discussion and analysis. And also, of course, there are various requirements of disclosure of risk factors. Now, because of these requirements, companies often do include some sustainability information in SEC filings. But let's go to the next slide. Recent work done by the SASB staff last year on the state of disclosure in SEC filings finds that while SASB disclosure topics are covered a lot of the times, in fact 74% of the times, the nature of those disclosures are often boilerplate and don't contain any metrics at all and the like. You can see in that chart, where across the different sectors that the SASB defines in its standards, it ranges from no disclosure through boilerplate through some company narrative, but in very little case any metrics. Let's go to the next slide. If you want to have a more detailed look at that, closer look at that for your industry and how your company stacks up against others, I would highly recommend you go to the SASB website and go to the SASB Navigator, which is a really cool tool. It includes not only the standards and explanations of those, but it includes this review of 4,300 plus public filings by industry, by company, and you can kind of see how your company stacks up in disclosure in your SEC documents against other ones in your industry. I would, in summary, the current landscape dominated by standalone sustainability reports and these questionnaires is something that investors do not find satisfactory yet. And I would just say, for somebody who's worked to improve the information set going into the capital markets for a good part of my life, I live by the axiom that what you measure and report matters, and to me the corollary of that is that we should therefore be measuring and reporting on those things that do matter. And with that, I'd like to hand over to our investor representatives to give their perspectives.
Yeah, so thank you, Bob. That's really helpful perspective. What we're going to do is we're going to do one more polling question before we transition into the investors. And so the polling question is, do your investors ask you about the impact of environmental, social, and governance factors on your business? And the answers are yes, often, yes, infrequently, and no, or NA. And I think this will give some very helpful perspective, particularly to Rocky and Mac as they frame their comments. So far we have about 64% of you have voted. Let's give it a couple of more seconds and then we're going to close the poll. So we will close the poll now, and we've got 31% say that investors do ask about this information, but infrequently. 17% say yes, often. So I think that's a pretty high response rate of investors asking about this information, and I think Rocky and Mac can give you some perspective on why that is. What I'd like to do is, as I mentioned earlier, investor interest in ESG disclosure is increasing, and I'd just like to let the participants on the webinar know about SASB's Investor Advisory Group, which includes investors with over $20 trillion of assets who manage a broad range of investment strategies. SASB's Investor Advisory Group members recognize the need for consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosure of ESG information. They believe standards would improve the quality and comparability of that information, and they believe SASB's approach, which is industry-specific and materiality-focused, will help provide investors with decision, useful, and relevant information. So I think it's really terrific today that we have both Rocky and Mac with us, because investors across who run many, many different types of investment strategies are interested in this information. Rocky's with SSGA, which is a very large manager of index strategies, which are sometimes called passive strategies. And Mac is with Columbia Threadneedle, which is an active manager, a manager of active strategies. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their perspectives today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rocky.
Thank you, Janine. So just to start the conversation, in January this year, we put out, we called on companies to start incorporating sustainability into long-term strategy, and we put out a thought piece or guidance that was developed after conversations over the past 3 to 4 years with over 1,000 companies across all regions in our portfolio companies in our regions. And the question we were asked is, why did you put this guidance out? And it really stems from the fact that we've been engaging with companies and for years on this issue. And I think the past 2 years, we've really started trying to have conversations on material sustainability issues with directors. And what we found is very few directors can actually talk to sustainability issues, and often will either hand off that conversation to the head of sustainability, or will then have or sometimes even the IR, who themselves can't really talk to the issue. So that was one of the reasons we felt that it was really time to convey that actually investors do care about the issue, and they're going to ask about this issue. So what we clarified or said that we as investors and passive index investors are reading your information, using these conversations to tier you based on 3 basic framework that we have. And as step 1, we want to see that you have identified material sustainability factors that can impact your business. Step 2 is really the assessment. So we would like for you to assess, and where and if you find it relevant and where necessary, incorporate the impacts of those factors into your long-term strategy. And the third, probably one of the most important, is communicate how or what impact the sustainability factor has had on your strategy. So based on this framework, we tiered companies, and we found that only 7% of companies really hit Tier 1. Tier 1 companies are those companies that actually undertake all three, do all three steps. Tier 2 companies, we classify them as who take 1 or 2 steps, but don't really incorporate all 3 steps. And so we found most of the companies really fall in that Tier 2 bucket, about 70% of companies, and the remaining fall in Tier 3, which is they do none of these steps. So what we then also did is, the question we also got is, why do you care about sustainability? And as an index provider, index investor, when you really think of sustainability, and I like to call them low probability, high impact factors. So the probability of something going wrong because of a sustainability issue is low, but when it does go wrong, it can go very wrong. So the impact can be very high. And what we've seen time and time again, whether it's an emissions issue, or it could be a safety issue, or it could even be a food safety issue, when something does happen, the impact on the stock price is very significant. So if you think of long-term and being what we call quasi-permanent capital, that in the long term, the probability of something going wrong, if it's not managed or mitigated or incorporated correctly, is significant. And then another question we often get is, what exactly do you mean by communicated effectively, and why? What are Tier 2 companies doing? What do they need to do to make it Tier 1? And an example I have is, say, of a financial services company who talks about talent or human capital being important, and talks about talent retention. What they do often in sustainability reports is that they will have very good disclosure on the programs that they have in place to encourage or to help with talent retention. But they don't give metrics year over year on what does talent retention look like. Are these programs really working? So for a shareholder you are telling shareholders, I think this is a material issue, and then you're not giving the information for us to be able to incorporate the sustainable, the aspect into to see if you're actually outperforming or you're actually doing a good job in talent retention. And here I would really like to end with the fact that I know Mac's going to talk about how investors use this, but what we have done in the paper is talked about what we would like companies, or what companies can do in terms of using improving utilization and impacts of sustainability into their strategy. And this is the bottom half of the slide, where we have 6 steps or 6 areas. So again, it's identifying material factors, analyzing the impact. If they do have an impact, does that drive any capital allocation decisions? Do we have the right board skills to oversee and ensure that these risks and even opportunities are being managed? Are we communicating all that we are doing and the impacts to investors who are now starting to integrate it? And third is, are we aligning the interests of management with appropriately, so incorporating sustainability into practices? What I found with SASB is that they really help with the materiality, the quantification, and actually give the framework for how you can go ahead and capture or quantify and even start collecting data if you're not already doing it. So I'll stop there.
Okay, terrific, Rocky. That is really helpful information. And what I'd like to do is transition to Mac and have Mac talk a little bit about his perspective in incorporating ESG information into active management.
Sure, thank you, Janine. I know we have a number of questions, so I'm going to focus my remarks. You'll see in the slide here that is up on your screen. I'll speak in a minute a bit about the mechanics of what it is you're looking at that looks rather complex, but just to sort of set the table in the context, describe what we do with respect to our active management. And our investment analysts exercise a fundamental analysis, meaning they're typically looking at the fundamental strategic and operating data of a company that's found in the financial statements, as we heard earlier. To use a word picture, I view that process as being a lot like an onion. The inner layers represent the various financial data that are traditionally analyzed. The non-financial ESG data are the outer layers. And for us as fundamental active managers, we need to see all of those layers to form a more complete, holistic view into a company's investment prospects. Without those outer layers, the analysis is incomplete, especially where we want to understand the company's long-term risks and opportunities. So how do we do that? We employ third-party ESG research, acquired ESG data, and we employ various rating systems that evaluate and score thousands of companies around the globe on their ESG performance. We then overlay that with our own proprietary research on companies and ESG themes that emerge from those evaluations. So the ESG research that's conducted on the companies, much like many of them represented on the call here today, sort of falls into two parts. First, the research identifies what risks companies in the various industries are exposed to that are, in fact, industry-specific. And second, and perhaps more importantly, then identifies how well management does in understanding and mitigating those various risks. So as you can imagine, the ESG risks that face a mining company are considerably different from the risks faced by companies that, say, develop software. The research adjusts for these differences on an industry basis, but one constant is that evaluation of, again, how well management understands those risks that they face, what they're doing to mitigate those risks, and to report on their performance along those dimensions. And this is where the company disclosures we've talked about here loom pretty large. If those disclosures are incomplete or are not presented on a comparable basis, your firm is not going to be accurately or properly evaluated. So to ease the analysis of fundamental ESG data, we've developed a suite of tools for our analysts and portfolio managers, and the image in the slide you can see on the screen is just one example of a tool that tells them about the ESG characteristics of, in this case, a portfolio. And with a few clicks, they can drill down into the specific ESG performance data that are shown here for any one of 6,000 plus companies around the globe. So this is an interactive data visualization tool that we created, although this one image doesn't really do much justice to it. It's one of several dashboards we have that allow portfolio managers to conduct a top-down analysis of the ESG characteristics in their portfolios relative to various benchmarks, or similarly in a different dashboard, they can look up individual companies, their ESG characteristics, and drill into the performance data for ESG factors across literally hundreds of data points, at least for some of the larger companies, right on down to they can see the underlying data sources, whether it came from a 10K, a press release, or some other regulatory filing. So this is a powerful tool. You can look, you can see the comparisons across various ratings in the upper left-hand corner. There's a drill down looking at certain of the securities that fall into one grading bucket, and then on the right is more issuer-specific and sector-specific information, all of which, when you click on it, allows you to drill down into that data I was describing. So this is powerful, but it's not really enough. And the reason why is because these ratings and the ESG performance data are all backward-looking. And while that can be interesting, it's what we call hygiene factors or hygiene data. Rarely for us does it send off what we call investable signals or signal anything meaningful on a go-forward basis about performance. And this is where we view the work of SASB comes in, is we believe that the future for investors in evaluating the ESG performance of companies and the future of companies disclosing meaningful, decision-useful information about their own performance is rooted in the SASB materiality standards and frameworks. As you saw some of this earlier, those frameworks allow both companies and investors like us to focus in on the core set of disclosures that are specific to a given industry and are really quite powerful in their own regard. We're connecting those factors with your performance data. So we as investment managers are beginning to integrate those very frameworks into our evaluations. And the next generation of this tool that you see that's in process right now carries that out and allows us to make determinations about sort of the future performance of a company. There's plenty of academic data, practitioner data, and other studies that link the companies that are strong ESG performers with those that are strong performers in the marketplace. So I'll close with one final comment. It's really an observation, but using an example. In my experience, this often comes as a shock to company managers when I engage with them, but I often will ask them, what do you think happens when there's a critical data point that you aren't disclosing, but that may be important to your investors? And a recent example was chatting with CFO of a company. We happened to chat about their carbon emissions. I happened to be looking at a data point in research, made mention of that data point, and this individual said, well, we don't disclose that. And I said, well, here it is in the research. And what we've learned, although while it's not ideal, it's not uncommon for research firms or investors or others to estimate, in this case, carbon emissions for this company based upon comparisons to your competitors who do disclose those figures. That's not helpful either to the companies or to investors, is to have that kind of data. Having a standardized framework rooted in materiality that's evidence-based and is consistent does a lot. And what we found is that this framework is helpful to us as investors. And hopefully with all this, you get a little insight into how we are looking at this data and why it's, in fact, important to us. So back to you, Janine.
Thanks, Mac. That's really excellent. And one of SASB's missions is to enable a common language for communication between investors and issuers on material sustainability issues. And I think seeing a real live example of how Mac and his team use this information in portfolio management, I think will really help issuers and understand how their information is ultimately being used. So thank you for that. We have one more polling question, which is, what is the biggest obstacle to achieving a greater level of sustainability disclosure to investors in your organization? And is that obstacle C-level buy-in? Is it the expected cost? Is it legal risk? Or is it something else? And if it's something else, just answer NA. So we would love to hear your view on this. We have about 50% of people who have voted so far. And while we're waiting for that, thanks to everyone who's sending in questions. We're getting some really great questions, and we're about to transition to the question period. So please keep your questions coming. So we've got about 65% of the people who have voted, so we're going to close the poll. And it looks like C-level buy-in is the highest topic, which is different from what I expected, to be honest. I expected to see legal risk as the highest concern. So that's very interesting feedback. So let's do this. Let's transition into the Q&A section of the webinar. And I'd like to start with a question we've gotten a couple of times, or a version of a question we've gotten a couple of times, which is, as we all know, we're going through a change in leadership in the SEC, and how will that potentially change the evolution of ESG disclosure? Will it potentially impact how willing companies are to disclose this information, particularly in SEC filings? And so I'd like to start by asking Bob for his views on that question, and then Rocky as to whether or not that will change investor priorities. But let's start with Bob.
Yeah, it's a good question. Question I get fairly frequently too. I think first it's very important to understand that the SASB was established really to meet what we saw increasingly as a market-driven need from investors, and also to deal with some of these increasing pressures on companies. And so I think I always viewed it as something that was market-driven and would evolve over time, just like financial reporting did, and not necessarily be driven by regulatory dictates. Now, that having been said, of course, we know that last year the SEC did put out a very lengthy concept release, and asking a lot of questions about potential ways to modernize and simplify the whole SEC reporting regime. That over 350-page document or so devoted about 11 pages, a significant portion to the whole realm of sustainability reporting. And not surprisingly, the investors who responded, and there were many, again confirmed that this is a very important topic from their point of view. So, we really don't know at this point, where the SEC will go. The nominee, Jay Clayton, has not yet been, approved by the Senate. But I really, again, I think I view this as market-driven. It would be good, in my view, if the SEC were to continue with this effort, broader effort to modernize, rationalize, simplify the reporting, their reporting structure and regime and forms and all of that. But I think an important part of that would be trying to recognize the increased investor demand around the reporting for sustainability information.
Great. Thanks, Bob. That's really helpful. And Rocky, do you want to talk about whether SSGA has changed its priorities in any way?
Yeah, so just to, I would say that, the change agent for ESG information or data is not the regulator here. It's been investors. And investors wanting information which is not purely financial, but as I've mentioned, because of what we've seen and all the other impacts which are non-financial that have had that have impacted stock price, which is one of the reasons why we want information on other practices which are non-financial. So I don't see that going away. I also see the growth of ESG investments and in that product, especially on the passive index investment side, whether it's from the inclusion or you exclude companies because of certain practices or sectors, or inclusion or including them because you believe that in the long term companies that are well governed and managed will actually generate alpha. So I see that, and that sector is really booming right now. So I think what we need as investors, the need for data and comparable data will not go away. I also would like to talk, we've been talking to companies about what has changed for them when it comes to a change in politics in DC. And companies often tell us that we are not here for a 4 to 8 year cycle. We are here for the long term. And if investors want something, we're going to have to give it, or else we're going to land up in situations that Matt just talked about, where you're going to anyway be evaluated or judged based on disclosure or non-disclosure. So you'd rather influence the reputation that you have in the market on sustainability issues.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Rocky. Our next question, I think, would be a good question for Mac, which is, someone is interested in knowing whether, and Rocky, I think you would be good to answer this too, knowing whether what you're really interested in is the actual metrics, like actual water consumed and the trend in that data, waste trends, or are you interested in knowing that the topic is being well managed, which may require you to know about the process, but not necessarily the actual metrics. So, Matt, could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, certainly. I think that's a good question, and it gets a little bit to what I described earlier as part of our evaluation. We're using and we're ideally seeking both bits of evidence, i.e. that in fact the company has recognized a particular risk and is managing it. At the same time, what the performance of companies are along those dimensions. At the end of the day, if we had to pick, if sort of forced answer, it would be metrics. And that metrics will ultimately tell us about the performance of a firm and gives us trackable, quantifiable information, as opposed to sort of how well it's being managed. Let's be frank, that can be a bit nebulous. It can be something as simple as presence of a policy, procedural documents, oversight by a board or board committee, for perhaps on a particular dimension. But it's a lot harder to measure and manage. So we ultimately, if we had to, we would suggest that the data becomes critical, and the data that in fact is comparable and can be measured across all other companies in a given industry tells us a lot more about performance. It's really no different than evaluating, ultimately think about it, a business strategy from the outside, from the investor perspective. It's one thing to state what a strategy is, it's another thing to actually be able to measure and monitor what the outcomes are, or the progress, if you will, is along a particular strategic dimension. And the investors will usually fall towards something that in fact can be quantified.
Great, that's helpful.
Yeah, so for me,
Rocky, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I'm going to add to what, because I agree with what Max said, but what, to me, it's not an either or question. To me, the data is required if you want, as you're creating products and ESG products, you do need data. So you do need actual performance and what your, quantifiable metrics. But I think stewardship is a very important aspect too for passive investors. And that means engaging at the board level, but also at senior management level. And I think what we look for is there a disconnect? So we often come across companies that have very good disclosure on sustainability, but and in some instances, and this is a high impact sector, they often identify, say for example, climate change as an imminent risk in their 10Ks or a long-term risk. And so if you are identifying it as a risk and a material risk, then why should I not have that conversation, and why is it that directors or very senior management can't really talk to what they're doing with regards to that risk? So a company, and we call these tier 1 companies, a tier 1 company really for us is both. One where it is a focal area from top bottom, but at the more granular level, they also provide that data. And the reason you to provide data is because eventually you really want, if you are going to set goals at the top level, you need data to evaluate how the company is doing against that goal. So it's like saying I'm setting sales targets, but I'm not really reporting on my sales targets. So so if you put it in financial terms, it just sounds bizarre that you would say sales are important, but you don't put any targets or don't provide investors with metrics. And that's what we think needs to happen with even material sustainable factors.
Okay, that's very helpful. And Rocky, I have a follow-up question for you about your tiering. Are you disclosing to companies what tier you have put them in, and what are the implications for companies in the lower tiers? What action will you take?
Right. So we're not going out of our way to inform companies. We really, through engagement, if we do disclose it, or we may just tell them what they could do to get to, the next tier 1 companies. We're happy to tell them. I think what we're really focusing on is tier 3 companies, and tier 3 companies are the ones for us in our portfolio are the ones that provide a great amount of risk. And so we're really focusing on those in terms of engagement, but also trying to move them along to explain to them why this really matters. And then the information we glean through engagement also informs our voting. So if you've seen what's happening in shareholder proposals, the nature of shareholder proposals is really moving towards environmental and social issues at companies. And this is another, you talk about product, but you don't really talk about the fact that you have reputational risk possibly coming from the fact that you may not have shareholder support, or you may have shareholders supporting shareholder proposals and being front page news because share a proposal calling on maybe a 2-degree scenario testing can pass, right? So I think we use that information about the culture towards sustainability, the approach to sustainability, to help inform our voting decisions also.
Okay, that's very helpful. And then we have a question, Bob, I think that would be helpful for your perspective on, which is about assurance. And do you see an increased demand and expectation for assurance of this information?
I think it's if I take the history of financial reporting, people provided capital in the late 19th century and early 20th century said, gee, we want better information and it ought to be standardized. And so you have the beginnings of accounting standards, not set officially, but some commonality often within industries. And then, the next question was, well, what kind of confidence can I have in it? Can we have somebody independent provide some assurance on it? And so you see that kind of evolutionary cycle with type of information. But certainly, if information is viewed as important by investors and they use it, they want to have they do want to have confidence in it. So, my speculation is that over time, as more of this information gets reported, probably the demand for assurance on it will also increase.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So we're running towards the end of the time, so I want to close with, I think, is a great question, and get the panelists' perspective on this one, which is, what are the biggest challenges to implementing standards for ESG disclosure to investors? I hate to put you on the spot, but Bob, why don't we start with you? What do you think the biggest challenges are?
I think the probably, as our survey said, it's sometimes or often the encouragement from the top, to go this way, coupled with sometimes the in-house lawyers, the secretaries say, gee, if we don't have to do it, why should we? Why should we do it? And I think that's that. But I think when you start to talk to people and they understand that this is really getting to material information in industry context, and that investors want it, but not only that, but by focusing on it, you can actually manage these things better, and it will help to improve your performance over time. Not only your performance on those issues, but because those issues are material to your performance, it'll improve your actual financial performance over time. And there's been a number of studies that have shown that.
Great. Mac, do you have a view on that question, the biggest challenge?
Well, yeah, and I think I would generally agree with what Bob just said, and I think the survey, the poll results earlier pointed us to one sort of challenge which might be paradigm related. I think there are a lot of different sort of antidotes to it, some of which is investors continuing to include ESG in their discussions with senior level managers. I think is one way to sort of break sort of the paradigm, if you will. I think also once senior leaders understand the value of the type of information that's being produced in response to these inquiries, either through mandatory disclosures, voluntary disclosures, you name it, I think that the usefulness, and Bob alluded to this, as management information, a way for management to assess its own process along different dimensions and perhaps some that haven't been previously measured, I think that goes a long way towards helping understand how there's a value add to doing this, and it's not just solely for the benefit of an outside audience, i.e. investors, but as well can be used internally. But I think that the paradigm thing is a big one, and it's one that we do see in the U.S. is there's this sort of thinking that anything that's ESG information is soft, fuzzy, values-oriented. That's the view of some, and it takes some time to break down those paradigms, and we've watched this occur certainly in European countries where I would put their progress around all things ESG as being at least a good decade ahead of where we are in the U.S. And in the U.S., we tend to suffer a bit from when you talk about some of these concepts with folks in our country, some will go to a thinking that this is socially responsible investing, and that means that for investors it's about excluding, Rocky references, sort of excluding companies based upon values judgments, when in fact this is really about inclusion, and it's about sort of having a seat at the table as a company to be fully part of the investment conversation and to control your messaging, to be able to control your disclosures in healthy, helpful, meaningful ways. And I think we will get there, but it's an evolution as Bob described.
Okay, excellent. Rocky, do you have any last words on what you see as the biggest challenge in implementing standardized ESG disclosure?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the only thing I have to add is that proving that sustainability really has an impact, either positive or negative, in terms of risk. And I think, and you need to really prove that at the highest level. So you need to explain to directors how it happens, because a person who is a sustainability head understands it. That's their job. Sometimes, that has to get translated into the CFO and then to the CEO and then to the board member. And I think that educating aspect is very important. I think when when they get it is when it becomes a reputational issue. So at the board level, when it becomes a reputational issue, they're like, oh, okay, I need to watch out for culture. Oh, I need to watch out for the pay practices of my salespeople, or I need to understand why my lettuce needs to be washed. So that's the challenge and once that's there, then you have, once firms that have actually understood why it's important, then they start focusing on these non-financial aspects.
Okay, thank you. That's extremely helpful. So thanks very much to the panelists. This has been a really interesting conversation. I want to let everyone on the line know that we've gotten many, many, many good questions that we didn't have time to get to today. And you can definitely reach SASB through sasb.org if you'd like to follow up on any of those questions. And please complete the survey that you'll get at the end of the webinar. It's very helpful feedback to us for planning future events. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. It was a really interesting discussion.